Okay, great. So I will hand the reins over to Desiree. She is our co-chair of the EdTech committee here. She can get us started.
So good afternoon, everybody. I am so excited to see all of you joining us today. Right now, it looks like there are about 170 folks online. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day. We are happy to have with us 3 appraisers to share their knowledge and answer your questions. We have Mike Dodds with Integra Realty Resources. He is a commercial appraisal. We have Chris Barzak with Barzak and Associates. Chris does FHA and conventional and maybe even VA appraisals. And then we have Steve Grimley from Ag South, who is our land specialist for us today. We are waiting on our VA appraiser to join us, having a few technical issues. For those of you who are on, Steve is having some technical issues with his screen, but you'll be able to hear him clearly whenever you have a question for him. We again are in a webinar format. Your chat is disabled, so please, any questions that you might have as we go through the process, use the question and answer box to submit them. And we'll get started. I'd like to go ahead and just ask each of our appraisers to kind of introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, what you do, how long you've been in the business, and what your area of specialty is. And we'll start with Mike, because he's the first one on my screen.
Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Mike Dodds with Integra. Been appraising commercial properties my whole life, which feels like it's been about 112 years. We work all over the state. We do all types of commercial. Lived in Charlotte for a little bit, so worked that market. We do just about everything. If I can ever help you with comps or anything, let me know.
Thank you, Mike. Chris, if you would.
Very good. My name is Chris Barzak. I have been a residential appraiser here in Columbia since 1993, so 30 years now. I complete FHA, VA, and conventional loans appraisals, and also a broker in charge. So I have a little bit of experience in both realms here, but I'm glad to be here and answer any questions that y'all might have.
Thank you so much. Steve, if you would, please.
Oh yeah, my name is Steve Grinley with Ag South Farm Credit. I've been a timberland and agricultural appraiser for approximately 16 years now. But I've been with Ag South for 10, and just looking forward to answering some questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And our last appraiser is on. Good afternoon, Lee. How are you? If you're having some technical difficulties, we can come back to you. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We have a list of questions that were submitted by a lot of our registrants when they signed up for today. So we'll start with those, and I'm sure that there'll be some questions that'll pop up in Q&A. And we'll just start from there. One of the first questions that was presented to us is regarding condo properties. The question is, are appraisers required, or do they need a condo questionnaire complete with financials and building information before you can complete an individual unit's appraisal? And if so, if not, what are you needing besides individual unit specs and comps? And I'll open this up to any of you who have experience with condos.
So I'll take that question, Chris Barzak. So condo questionnaires are not required for us to review. The lenders are the ones that typically request those, and it's my practice to ask the lender if they have that in hand or not. We find that there is a lot of information that is not covered that we need as appraisers in the condo questionnaire, but it's good to have as just additional information for our work file. So they're not required for us to do our work. There is a lot of additional information that condo appraisals require that a typical single family would not. We need to gather information on parking. Is parking adequate for the community? Is there enough spaces for the owners themselves and for visitors? We need to understand how many total units there are, how many total are for sale, how many are rented. We need to know who is in control of the homeowners association, if it's an outside agency. We need to know if any specific owner owns more than 10% of the units. That's a critical piece of information for the lender. Is there any commercial use on site, say like a live work type scenario? Is there anything like that? We need to understand what utilities are included in the HOA fee. We need to understand the common areas on what is included and what is maintained. It's a lot of extra information, and it is difficult for us sometimes if it's the first time we've done an appraisal in a certain condo development, because then it's a lot of new information. But so it's quite it's more burden on us in condo appraisals, and they are a little more difficult.
Okay, thank you. I didn't even realize that myself, so I think that's great information. One of the next questions was, when a seller is thinking of doing a home renovation, and we have a couple of questions that kind of apply to the renovations. How do you attribute market value to renovations? And does the timing of the renovation give you more of a boost or an impact to the value you give it when you're doing an appraisal? And if there are any renovations that, as appraisers, you would almost recommend as being a high dollar renovation to help them get maximum value? Anybody can answer it.
So that I'll take the first stab at it. That's
Okay.
probably the most, this is Chris Barzak, that's probably the most common question that I think that I get from either just speaking with somebody either at their property, working on their appraisal themselves, or just from friends, family, or just public in general. It's a very difficult question to answer. So many times it depends on the property itself, on what is in need. So I would probably, in most cases, start with what is in need at the property. Is there anything that is substandard, anything substandard condition on the property? That would probably be the first thing that you would want to address.
Okay.
What's important when it comes to comparison and trying to determine the value of improvements is we try, and it gets very subjective on what value is attributed to different renovations. And what you aim to do as the appraiser is to find comparable sales that are similar. So if you have a house that's 50 years old and it's got lots of renovations done to it, you try and find a similar aged house that has a comparable degree of renovations. And that way you eliminate the subjectivity in the adjustments, because you're comparing two properties that are similar. Now that's a perfect situation. It's a perfect ideal situation. And sometimes that happens, that you're able to eliminate the subjectivity from that perspective. But the important part is to identify properties that have a similar degree of updating done.
So then is it true or is it false that improvements that were done in the last 3, 6, or 9 months carry more value than the same improvement that might have been done a year or 2 years previously?
I would say yes, it does. Again, it's critical that you identify the sales that are very similar. If you don't have that, I always tell people that it's a very imperfect job that we have. We don't have the opportunity. If I'm appraising a house that I walk into it and I'm able to identify a fully renovated kitchen, fully renovated bath, I'm relying on, when I'm making comparisons to that property, obviously I have the opportunity to walk through all the comparable sales. So I'm relying on sometimes on photos and information provided by the agents of those properties. And a lot of times that information is not perfect. You'll see many times in the multiple listing service that, yes, this property's been fully renovated, and really maybe they just had the carpet cleaned and some touch-up paint done. So it's very difficult. That is the most difficult adjustment on the appraisal, that just off the top of my head that I say. So it's critical that you find comps that are comparable. And if you don't have them, then it's a very much case-by-case basis on how you determine the value of those adjustments. And so I'd be interested on hearing other appraisers on what they would say on that.
Well, that also ties into a question that jumped in the Q&A. So I want to pull it together because you mentioned having incomplete information, but one of our participants said, but there are a lot of appraisers who don't want to talk to the agents to get that enhanced information. So is there a standard that says you can't talk to us, you can't receive the detailed information outside of the MLS? Why would an appraiser be hesitant to speak to an agent if it meant getting that enhanced information? You know, maybe the list from the owner that says, you know, renovated in this date, this was done this year, and things of that nature. Are you guys allowed to talk to us, or are there limits to the conversation?
No, it should be strongly encouraged that you are able to obtain as much information as you were able to get, whether it comes from whatever party it comes from. They got to be reliable. But you know, each party in a transaction is going to have their own incentives. It's going to be the incentive of the seller to brag about what they have, but bring all the information you have a list for me, have the agent have a list for me. Obviously I'll corroborate some of that during my inspection period, but it's very helpful for me to understand, you know, the kitchen renovations. That was it done 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, although some of that will be determined by my observation. But I always tell people the more information that I have, the better. There's no question that should be the standard for us.
Thank you.
Steve Grenley here. I'll just follow up on what Chris is saying. Sometimes there are situations where we cannot speak to the realtors, and it's not that we can't speak to you. It's not that we can't discuss certain items, i.e. value, client, privacy issues, client information, certain things like that. And I agree with Chris. I will call anybody and ask 100 questions. And then there's cases when you're operating with a dual agency, if somebody's representing the buyer and seller, there's things I cannot tell you based on the relationship that we have being engaged by by whoever our client is. So there's sometimes that we can't, but for the most part, we're more than happy for you to give us all the information you can.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Rusty, there's a question for us in the Q&A regarding a commercial building. It's Mike, let's see, Rusty asked this question: for a commercial building that's in an isolated location, i.e. no other commercial properties nearby, how do you approach developing an appraisal?
We would generally look at just similar demographics in other areas. If we're doing something that's rural up towards Winsboro, we would probably look rural towards Chester, rural towards Newberry, and just not try to get near the bigger cities. Looking at the underlying land value is kind of the focus. But nowadays, with we're kind of mind readers. We don't know what our lender clients are really looking for, because some of them have a checklist that says it has to be in the same county, and sometimes that makes sense, sometimes it does not. But generally looking for comparables with a similar underlying land value.
Okay, thank you. And for any of you, we have a question that says, for the appraisals, commercial or residential, how many comps are required minimum? And if we are assisting our clients with determining pricing at an earlier stage, how many comps should we be using? Should we be using more or less than what you're using? So what are the minimum requirements for a commercial and a residential appraisal as far as the comps that are being used?
Steve Grenley, I'll take this one just real quick from,
Thanks, Steve.
I work for an agricultural lender, so we see a lot of stuff that we see in-house and we have done by fee appraisers such as Mike and Chris, and we see those. From a lender's perspective, we have no requirements on how many you have. Typically, we'll see 3. If they put in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever they feel is necessary to support their answer, we're completely fine with that. Other lenders do require a minimum number. Typically, that's going to be 3 to 5. But for us, if you've got 3 good comparable sales, we're very happy with 3. If you get 7, we're happy with 7. So it really depends on what that fee appraiser and wants to do in order to support their value determination.
Is that the same for everybody? If you're on, is that the same for VA? Will VA accept more than 3, or is there a set number that has to be used?
I typically just do VA appraisal. So yeah, I use 3, and VA doesn't want, so it will not let us give weight to pending listings or active listings, but I simply put them in there and call it additional market data. I use 3. On most time, if I've got something way out a rural area, I have nothing and I have to go miles one way, miles to the other, I may have to use 4 or 5 sales because I have nothing similar.
Okay, well then
But typically it's 3.
perfect. Well, then that brings us to the question that somebody else had, and it's specifically for VA, which is if a VA appraiser goes through or invokes Tidewater, how long does that appraisal stick with the property? And if a new VA buyer comes along and the seller is willing to accept a second offer with the VA loan, can they use the appraisal on file and pay a gap, or do you have to start over with a new appraisal? I know that was several questions in one. I hope I didn't confuse the process.
I think FHA is like that the appraisal stays with that property. Chris, I think the VA is just that case number that goes with that particular veteran. So if a new appraisal is needed, they can get another appraisal. Chris, is that right?
So
I can't remember.
I don't, Desiree, I don't know the answer to that question. That's something that's really outside of our control. That's that's typically determined by the lender on whether a new appraisal is required. You know, we get called out by our lender client or the VA to go do the assignment. And once we're done with it, it kind of goes into their space. They deal with it. They share it with who they want to share it with. And whether an additional one, I don't know what the criteria or what the threshold is that would either require a new one or how long it stays, or maybe different lenders have different, different guidelines on how they use it or how long they can use it and that type of thing. So they really don't, that information be out there, but it's really not relevant to us so much.
Okay, because I
know with the FHA appraisal, I do know that sticks with that property for 6 months. I buy it and I've had some appraisals that came in low and they couldn't sell it, so that ruled out FHA for 6 months.
Okay, because I thought the conversation that we hear is with VA appraisals. If if a property doesn't appraise with a VA appraisal, that value, that appraisal is borrower specific. So if that borrower walks away from the deal and then a second VA buyer comes along to that same property, they're able to get a new appraisal and potentially have a value that the first one didn't get. So is that not the case, or is that lender specific?
That is the case with the VA. That's happened to me on a couple of properties that I tried to sell that went VA and it didn't work the first time. And I had another VA appraiser come out with another buyer and it worked. So I know that works. I've been in that situation. FHA, no.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Kim, you had a question that you saw?
Yes, this is kind of going back to the renovations. There was a question about they're saying when you're appraising renovations, they're asking what if it's specifically, I guess, for aesthetic purposes. I'm not sure exactly what what they mean by that, but they're just saying for appraising renovations, what if it is for aesthetic purposes?
Meaning, is there value to a renovation that's done just because it's something cosmetic that the seller wanted versus an improvement to something existing, potentially?
Yeah, is it going to change? Is that really going to change the value? I guess that's what they're trying to get at.
I'll try and answer that question. So what we are required to do is what we call bracketing. And so some people will do customized renovations and something very unique. And it is difficult sometimes to determine whether it contributes value or how much it'll contribute value. So the answer again to that question is we have to try and find sales comparisons that have the same feature. Let's say, let's say you have a putting green in your backyard or a tennis court in your backyard. It's a unique scenario, but we do our best to identify a comparable sale that has that same feature or that same improvement or that same renovation, that type of thing. And that way it takes the subjectivity out of how much we assign to that improvement. But to answer the general question of will cosmetic improvements assist in value? Yes, I would say that's generally, yes, it will.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
In our Q&A, we have several questions that are tied to VA. So I'm thinking, Lee, Chris, these are for you, and I'm going to try to lump them together. They appear to all be tied to a turnaround and tide water, which is if there's a tide water, what is the process for challenging it? And is there, how often do you see tide waters successfully being challenged to get the values increased from whatever deficiency might have been seen? So Lee or Chris, I guess this would be for you.
Tide water, you get 2 business days. We have to notify the POC, and the POC is supposed to notify all parties involved with that transaction that there is a tide water issue. Tide water code word for the values coming in under the contract price. And I don't give any information as to what comparables I'm using or where our value is. We wait for that for additional sales from the lenders. Usually that's from the seller's agent. We're looking at the same data that those agents are. So it doesn't work a lot. It has some. I mean, over the years that I've doing this, I've have missed some things. So it's a good check and balance system. Chris?
I agree. I think that I almost in some cases wish they would use that for conventional and FHA opportunities.
Agreed.
Yeah. For me, I feel like if the appraised value appears to be below a contract price, I almost enjoy putting the burden on the agent to assist. Say, hey, look, I said, I reviewed all the sales. You guys have come up with a contract price that is not being supported by the market. Show me what you saw. Show me what is going to prove to this lender that it's worth what is being, what this contract is. So I don't mean to say I enjoy it, but it does kind of share that burden. And certainly I'll review whatever new information comes in. But just like Lee said, we were looking at in most cases, the same exact information. I wouldn't give you a percentage, but I have changed a few, but not a high percentage. So we give the lender, we tell the point of contact with the lender that it looks like we're coming in lower than the contract price, and they have 48 hours to respond to us. And if they have not given us any additional information, then we just move forward.
Well, that's actually very good because someone said, you mentioned, not being able to support the value. So do you take into consideration the fact that some of these homes, VA or otherwise, are the results of multiple offers? So the pricing that you see is based on the demand in the market and people willing to pay a price that you might not see in comps yet, but maybe the trend is, and we saw it a lot during COVID where people were coming at houses so fast and so furious, you were having contracts turn over faster than the appraisals were turning around. And the demand was a factor because people were willing to pay it with or without a gap. Is that something that you take into consideration, like cost of living or something else, the fact that people want it and are willing to pay it, even though maybe the closed properties haven't caught up with what you're seeing from a data standpoint?
Lee, you want that one? Or that's really applicable to all types of appraisals.
Yes.
So we are required to, we have an effective date on our appraisal. The day we go out and do the inspection is, in most cases, our effective date of the appraisal. And yes, when prices are either rapidly increasing or rapidly decreasing, we're using market data that is 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 6 months ago. So we are required to account for what's happened in the market between the date of that comp sale and our date that we're appraising. That is a requirement of ours. So I've been doing this for 30 years. I don't remember a time of rapid increases or decreases. There was a time during the first crash years ago, but lenders became much more accepting of time adjustments, and time adjustments were very useful in those times of rising prices and falling prices. So it is our requirement to analyze what you're referring to.
Do you allow, or is there the ability to readjust? Say, I've seen on appraisals where you have pending comps that are added, I guess, as a supplement. If that property were to close a day after you submitted your report, but that comp is one that would be used to support the value better than one that was previous, do you have to do a tidewater? Do you have to go through a massive process to have that re-evaluated because of the newer information? And what do you do to advise that tidewater or any of these changes have occurred?
So pending sales became much more prevalent, at least for me, when I'm trying to support my time adjustments. That became much more prevalent. Almost every appraisal I was using pending sales as those prices were rising so much. That helps me support my time adjustments. But yes, if you're talking about now a closed sale that has either happened after we did our appraisal and before you close a loan, if that new information comes out, that would be, I suppose, up to the lender on whether or not they want to ask us to reconsider the appraisal. I would imagine that if you as a borrower or a real estate agent have seen this happen, that you would want to ask the appraiser to reconsider it. And it basically goes to the lender. The lender on whether or not they're going to open this case back up or not. It wouldn't be up to me. You can't really come to me and say, hey, this new information's out there. Can you change the appraisal? We can only take direction from our client. So that would be the procedure is the borrower or possibly the agent would reach out to the lender and say, hey, there's new information out there. Is this something you're willing to consider?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. There is a question that we received. How are finished basements, detached living spaces, finished rooms over the garage valued if the finishes or the ceiling height or the ceiling types are not the same as the main square footage?
That sounds like a good question for Lee.
Are you there?
Yeah, we can hear you. Well, Chris, if you want to take it, or if Mike, you want to take it before Lee gets back.
It's going to go back to an answer that you've heard me say a couple of times. We would do our best to identify other houses with basements. Basements have always been difficult in our market. They're not that commonplace. You see all different types of quality of finishes, ceiling heights. You may see a drastic difference between the upper level and the lower level as far as quality or condition, or they may be very similar. So many of these questions are on what's the issue in front of me? What's the appraisal in front of me on how I treat that scenario? In many cases, I will give a basement the same contributing value. That's my dog. The same contributing value in a basement as I would the upper level if they're very similar in the functional utility of it, if the quality and the condition are all similar. So as many as you know, you've walked in many different types of basements, and they will contribute differently in many cases. So that
I'm gonna finish this webinar down here. You're just gonna sit there for a second.
That leads to another one, I know a question that's on the list as far as ceiling heights.
Yes.
I think that would maybe the appropriate time to answer that one. So what we've been asked to do recently in the last year is something called ANSI, A-N-S-I. It's a standard in our industry now as far as measuring houses. And it's something that has been lacking the 30 years I've been in it. Is there's really no standard on what counts as heated or gross living area or the heating area. So the new rules that have come out, they've got 3 or 4 different little nuances to them. Number one, any ceiling height below 5 feet, let's say it's a knee wall in a room over the garage or something along those lines, any of that below 5 feet does not get counted. That's an automatic disqualifier if part of the room is below 5 feet high. So that automatically gets taken. It contributes in value, and we'll call it storage or whatever you want to call it, but it gets valued in a different section of the appraisal. The other one that's a little bit harder to apply is if you have half the room, let's say you're in a room over the garage, half the room has to have a ceiling height of above 7 feet or above. So if half the room is not 7 feet tall, then none of the room counts as gross living area. That one gets a little trickier to measure in some of the upper levels of houses, but the third thing I know that people have always, and even appraisers but amongst ourselves, always never really had an understanding was staircases. Staircases contribute, the area of the staircase is measured on both floors, I guess is the easiest way to put it. So you count the area of the staircase on the upper level, and you count the area of the staircase on the lower level. So you don't really back out unless it's like an open foyer where you have an open place all the way to the second floor. You do count the staircase square footage into the second floor as well.
So is it being counted twice, or is it half on the first, half on the second?
Well, it's almost counted as floor space on, it's counted, the lower level, there's never been an issue. It's always been counted on the lower level. You don't cut out the area of the staircase. So the question always was the second level, does it contribute to the floor space in the second level? And the new answer to that is yes, it always does.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, in our Q&A, there is a question. How will FHA and VA view value if a settlement crack is on sheetrock, but it's not deemed structural by an engineer?
Anybody else?
It's not gonna be me.
So you're saying if somebody's identified drywall crack, and the question is again, what? If the structural engineer has already seen it and does not say it's structural?
It says, how will FHA and VA view the value or assign value? I guess it's not super clear, but it says, how will FHA and VA view value if a settlement crack is on sheetrock, but it's not deemed a structural defect by an engineer? Is this something that you guys view as cosmetic when you're doing your evaluations and you see the crack and you notate it, or does it have no bearing at all?
Well, frankly, in most of the cases that I've run across, we don't already know whether or not it's been structurally deemed anything. In most of the cases, we're the ones calling for an inspection because we don't know. I mean, I would say less than 10% of the time, I will have that information going to my inspection. I'll have already known that a structural engineer has been out there. Most of the time, it's me identifying either big mortar cracks and bricks or, unlevel floors or drywall cracks. And then we're not qualified as appraisers in most cases to determine whether or not they're structural or not. So if there is a certain degree and there's no industry standard on whether a crack's got to be a centimeter or an inch wide, but in most cases, you'll need to determine whether or not there's a structural issue. And that usually falls on us, it seems like, or a home inspector telling the borrower that, hey, look, we need more detail here. The question you presented is if it's already been determined that it's not structural. I guess the answer to that is if we think it's going to affect the value in whether or not we make an adjustment for the condition of the house. So let's say we've got several cracks around the house that are not structural, but is it to the point where it's going to affect the market value of trying to sell that house with a bunch of cracks in the drywall? And then we would probably make some type of adjustment for condition, maybe what it would cost to paint or to go and spackle the walls and paint. There may be also an issue if the house was built prior to the 70s and you're dealing with lead paint and you've got damaged drywall, that may come up for FHA and VA on whether or not that's a concern from a safety perspective on lead paint.
Okay. There was a question from someone wants you to please explain what ANSI is again. They didn't catch the full definition of what ANSI was.
Okay, I don't know the acronym and what it stands for, but it's I guess it's an organization somebody came up with that has determined this is the way you properly measure a house in today's standards. They have defined the rules. ANSI defines on how you measure a house and what we've talked about, the staircases and the rooms over the garage, the ceiling heights, those are all outlined in ANSI's in what they've developed. And it basically gives us a standardization in our industry, which was lacking.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat. I guess anybody could answer this one. They're saying if an item associated with a property is noted on a sales contract as being sold as is, does this excuse the appraiser from evaluating the item on his or her report? So you guys
I'll take that one on this one.
No.
Steve Grinley here.
No.
No, it absolutely does not. Just because the listing says that this particular property is being sold as is, or the house or the dwelling or barn or whatever the structure is has no value, that is not typically the case. It may not have any contributory value, but it is still there. And in certain cases, it may be valued, but it's generally dependent upon what the comparable sales are telling you. We see that a lot with farm properties, with barns and that type of thing. If the barn has reached at the end of its expected life and is basically falling down, then yeah, it has no value. But if it's something that you can actually utilize, then it probably does have value and it'll be addressed in the report.
Okay, thank you.
Is there a standard price adjustment per square foot for a log cabin that does not have interior drywall?
I'll answer that one as well. The answer quickly on that one is going to be no. Um,
Yeah.
when you get to standards are great for things like measuring houses and describing units of measure, units of comparison when looking for an appraisal. But when you go to looking at adjustments on per square foot basis or a per acre basis, or even on a water foot frontage basis, there's really no standard. That information is taken from the comparable sales and the sales and research and analysis done by the appraiser.
Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
All right, there's a couple of other, one of them is, I guess they're asking, what does an appraisal preparation look like when appraising a home? I guess they're saying what sort of preparation you guys do prior to going out and doing the appraisal. I'm assuming that's what they're trying to say.
I'll take this one as well. Typically what we do is we would go ahead and identify the subject, get everything we have from the lender. And then at that point, do a lot of comparable sales research. I typically like to look at all the sales before I go and look at the subject. Just so I have an idea of if I'm comparing apples to apples and make sure those properties are truly comparable. A lot of the pre-planning portion of the report is done prior to even getting to the subject property, because you know roughly what you're looking at, and once you get those details, the measurements on the house, then you can come back in and you can finalize those adjustments based on the comparable sales. But yes, a good amount of the work is done before you leave the office and head to the property.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to back that up. That's changed a lot over the years. Now there's so much information that's out there that you are able to do a lot more on the front end than you used to. And it is helpful to have a little bit more understanding of the property before you get there. So I agree. I do much more. I do a higher percentage of the work now before I go out than I used to, for sure.
That's awesome.
And I concur with that. As well. I mean, I have contract in a digital work file. I have contracts. Every comparable sale is a PDF in my work file. Even their property cards, and it takes a few seconds to put that data into a digital work file and pull it up when I'm at the property to see, all right, which sale am I going to use now? I've gathered 6 to 8 sales here, and which are the best ones. So I've got all that information right there. It doesn't work all the time. Sometimes you do have to go back, but
Well,
there's so much data that you can have right there at your fingertips.
That's good to know. I think we need to do the same thing in preliminary preparation when we're working with clients, as well as to get that kind of digital file put together. But this is a question that has come up in the chat, and I've personally seen it, and I'm sure other folks have. And I wonder, for all of you appraisers, houses are going into the MLS under a particular list price, but at the point they go under contract, agents are changing that list price to the contract price before it closes. Does that impact the valuation, if that's the correct phrase, on how you're determining value? Does it now look like that the list price is, do you see the change to be able to notice that it's been changed? Or is that futile effort on behalf of the listing agent to, help get them where they need to be?
I'll take that one. I would prefer, if you listed at 400 and it goes under contract at 380, just leave it in there. That gives us some additional information that says right now, that list price was not supported because you've got somebody under contract $20,000 less. The more data that we have and the more information that's true and accurate in the MLS and also in conversations we have with realtors, the better off we're going to be. Because if we know, because sometimes it's listed at 400 and it goes under contract at 420, we still would like to know what it started out as, so you can have some indication as to whether or not that market's moving up, down, or whatever direction it is.
So the recommendation is leave it alone.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Leave it alone. There's no need to go back and change it.
I think I'll add to that. I feel like that's a little bit misleading. And it makes it more difficult on us as appraisers that that's the case. Especially when we're analyzing comps and we want to see that it does help if I see, especially in a time of rising prices, and I go and see the 3 comps that I chose, all 3 of them went under or sold for higher than what they were listed at, that impacts us. We can still identify that information through the history of the listing, but you have to dig further for it. And I'm not sure that's really a question for the MLS. I wish the MLS would either put out a bulletin for that, or if they would make a rule on that. I think it rises to that point of just good information, good solid information. I think that, to me, I think that's misleading to do it.
Well, with that good solid information, we know that you're pulling your comps from the listings in the MLS that have closed. Do you ever, in your digital file that Lee mentioned, go a little deeper and do a tax record search to see if there are transactions that are tax record only that may not have hit the MLS to help get value? Because that's a little bit less detailed information, but I'm sure that those transactions do exist.
That's required. That's part of our standard as an appraiser. That's a requirement of our part. It's not whether we want to do it or does some appraiser do it. We have to analyze any prior listing, in some cases a year, sometimes 3 years, on whether or not there's been any prior listings or sales of our property that we're appraising, as well as the comparison. So that's a requirement on all of our parts.
Gotcha. So if there is a tax sale transaction that is a viable comparable, will you use that in place of something that's found in the MLS?
I don't know that we'd use it in place of, but it's certainly something that could be included in the report. Additional information is never a bad thing. And that's what most appraisers would always want. The more information you can give us, the better off we're going to be. And the more transparent you are with us, the better off. Especially with regards to lands transactions, a lot of them do not end up on MLS. I'm working on one right now. It's a 450 acre tract, and I guarantee you, if I go look in MLS, I'm not going to find any of them. So I'm using county records. We read deeds, much research, and calling and talking to real estate agents as we can to confirm what exactly went on with that transaction and what exactly happened, as best we can figure out between the buyer and seller.
Thank you. Thank you. We are down to our last 5 minutes, and so we have maybe 4 questions left. Steve, were you able to answer the mobile home question? Did you want to answer that live, or were you answering that privately?
I missed it in the chat. Somebody else got it, but basically on the mobile home, if a mobile home is there and it needs to be removed, generally what we can look at is a cost to cure. And what we would do in that particular case is get an estimate from clearing and hauling grading company. Somebody's willing to go out there and remove the mobile home. And that could have a positive, it could contribute value to the property, knowing that you're going to have to spend $5,000 to $10,000 to have this thing removed. It's something that we can certainly consider.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
And we have another pool question real quick. What value is being presently added for a newly installed pool with full hardscaping and high-end landscaping, aside from looking at existing comps where pools already exist? Do you want to see the receipts?
Oh yeah, contribute to it. We can always look at the cost of anything. It doesn't necessarily, the problem is cost does not necessarily contribute the value. The analogy I use, and it's probably a horrible one, but you can go across the street to your local Chevy dealership and go buy a brand new Tahoe. And if you're willing to pay $100,000 for a Tahoe that they're selling for $80,000, there's not a whole lot we can do about that. And at some point, there's kind of law of diminishing returns applies, and it's not something that's standard. But we would look at that. If you spend $120,000 on a pool, and you can get the same utility out of a pool for $60,000, then that extra $60,000 might not have any value.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can maybe want to add something a little bit to that. A lot of times, just for instance, a pool, why cost also automatically doesn't translate to value is there may be a lot of cost associated with getting the land prep to put a pool in. I mean, the same pool can cost 60,000 in one house and 100,000 in another.
Right.
Based on, you got to put retaining walls up, and that doesn't make typically, unless it's cosmetic, has some great cosmetic add to it. But a lot of times the cost of something is dictated by the previous existing circumstances, that the cost is exaggerated because you're trying to fix a negative somewhere else. So
Oh, good point. Very good point. We have our 2 final questions in our Q&A before we wrap it up, and thank you guys for your time. On lake properties, do you give any value based on the condition of the dock or existence of boat lifts? Do they add value? Is there a benefit financially from your standpoint to assisting in the value of the home?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. Absolutely, they do. Anytime you're with a lake property and it doesn't have a dock or has a very poor condition dock, and your subject has a great dock and is in excellent condition, or newer boat lift, yes, there will be an adjustment made to account for that. Absolutely, 100%.
Awesome, awesome. And do you adjust for commissions when you use a for sale by owner as a comparable where there's no commission or only commission on one side versus a fully involved comparable? Is there an adjustment for value because commissions are being paid on one or both sides versus the for sale by owner?
I will try and answer that question. So it's the same cost to the buyer in most cases. So I would say in most cases, no, that won't come into play. Anybody else have a different perspective of that?
I've seen it done both ways. I've seen some appraisers that do adjust for it, some of them don't. And I don't think that personally, I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer to that. As long as it's done consistently. That's the biggest thing. If you're going to do it in one setting, you might want to do it. If you're going to do it for one set, do it for the other as well.
So you're really supposed to analyze whether or not anything was added to the agreed upon contract to cover the cost of the agency. So that analysis is done in each individual circumstance. So if they added $6,000 so they can pay your buyer agency, then that would probably not be, then you would make that adjustment for $6,000 on the appraisal.
But you would need to see that specifically delineated somewhere, so that was for agency versus closing cost or repair or something else.
Yes, if you're using a for sale by owner as a sale, you're interviewing all those people regardless, and you'll find that and make that adjustment.
Okay, well, thank you. We have hit 1 o'clock, and so we appreciate everyone for their time, and a huge shout out and thanks to all of our appraisers who are on our panel. As we wrap up, do each of you have anything that you want to share with our participants and us to be able to let us know best practices, things we can do to help make your job easier while you're trying to help us? Mike, I saw your hand, go for it.
Yeah, I just want to share a statistic that I thought was interesting, that I was surprised that home offices or work from home didn't come up today. But I read this morning that in 2019, which was the last full year before the pandemic, 7 times more office space was built nationally than was torn down. So 7 times more built. In the first 6 months of this year, 3 times more office space has been demolished than is under construction. So the work from home thing is here to stay. So I don't know whether you guys are seeing, homes with private offices or upscale offices or more marketable nowadays, but I thought that was an interesting statistic that ties a hard number to the trend. So
That's a great information. Great information. Chris, you have anything that you'd like to share or recommend as we wrap up to help us help you help us?
No, nothing that comes to mind. I'm not prepared for that one.
Steve, how about you as we wrap up?
No, I think generally, open lines of communication among everybody makes this easier for everyone. And then also, one of the things from a lender's perspective that we haven't talked about today, is timing on contracts. We have a lot more federal regulations and steps that we've got to go through these days to get, especially when you're dealing with land, and even more so with houses. Just be conscious of those contract dates, and the days of 30-day close, those are pretty much gone for the most part for lenders, just because it takes the number of steps it takes in order to get to the closing table is far greater than it ever has before.
Appreciate that. I've heard that from a couple of lenders recently. There are some that still push it, but every day helps. So prepare your folks up front and negotiate appropriately. Lee, did you have anything to share as we're wrapping up?
I don't. I apologize for the technical issues, but I'm always available for any VA questions. You can call me or email me anytime, and I'll happy to help you with that.
Well, we appreciate you.
Anybody.
Thank you so much, everybody. This is being recorded, so it will be posted on the CCRA Facebook page and YouTube page, and we'll try to add a comment in there with the contact information of all of our appraisers. So if you have any questions that you didn't get answered or specific issues that you'd like to discuss with them, we'll make sure that you have all of their information. Thank you so much, everybody who attended, and we'll see you again. Our next Lunch and Learn is scheduled for October the 4th, and we'll be discussing county tax record and register of deed searches. So look in your newsletter from yesterday and go ahead and sign up for that, and we'll see you guys soon. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Thank you.